Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're digging into a really wide-ranging conversation.
Yeah, from the Joe Rogan Experience with Joe Rogan and Jillian Michaels.
Right. And we're pulling out the key insights, the surprising bits, stuff about media trust, health, society, even good and evil, actually.
It covers a lot of ground.
It really does. And our mission here is to kind of distill it for you, make it digestible without you feeling totally overwhelmed.
Okay, so where do we start? That generational media thing seemed like a big one.
Yeah, that jumped out. How different generations see the media, right? The anecdote about talking to parents about news sources, it felt familiar.
Totally. This idea that maybe older generations had this implicit trust in mainstream news, while younger folks, often more skeptical, looking for other viewpoints, it really shows a shift in, how we process information now.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack that.
Yeah.
Because it connects to something else they discussed, this tendency, even for smart people, to really defer to experts.
Right, without maybe questioning enough sometimes.
Exactly. And the early days of COVID, that was a prime example they brought up. Remember the reaction to Brett Weinstein's early ideas about the virus origin?
Oh, absolutely. The pushback was intense against anything outside that initial narrative, like Weinstein exploring the lab leak idea early on.
And what's interesting is how much later, big outlets like the New York Times eventually did acknowledge the lab leak theory.
Yeah, but the way they framed it, it wasn't really like, oops, we were wrong, more like, here's some new info.
Right. And they contrast that. Imagine if podcasters, gave out really bad medical advice.
Oh, the backlash would be immediate, intense, calls to shut them down, for sure.
It really makes you think about the different standards, doesn't it? Who gets scrutinized and how.
That difference in accountability, perceived or real, is huge. And it leads right into Jillian Michaels talking about having a vaccine scientist on her show.
Ah, yes. And her sort of realization afterwards, apologizing about the experimental nature of the mRNA tech back then.
And the fact that maybe we didn't have all the answers or didn't fully appreciate some details.
She mentioned that point the scientist made about the tech being around 30 years, but it didn't quite match the scientist's own age. Needed clarification there.
Right, and the whole emergency use authorization thing, that was crucial.
It basically let them bypass the usual long-term trials because, well, it was an emergency.
And the fundamental difference, too, between traditional vaccines like a dead or weakened virus and the mRNA approach.
Which is more like giving your body instructions, temporary instructions to make a protein. That difference wasn't always made clear, I think.
No, it wasn't. And the EUA meant faster deployment, sure, but less long-term data initially. The mechanism itself telling your cells to make the spike protein, it's just different.
And they brought up other concerns too, right? Like aspiration.
Yeah, the practice of pulling back the plunger slightly to check if you're in a blood vessel, concerns that maybe that wasn't always happening.
And the potential link, however debated, to myocarditis. It just adds layers of complexity.
Absolutely. And even beyond the rollout, how our understanding evolved later.
Like how long the spike protein might actually stick around. Or the potential for shedding.
Things we learned, or are still learning, over time. It really highlights why asking questions, even uncomfortable ones, is important. And maybe not dismissing other views right away.
Definitely. Okay, shifting gears a bit.
Yeah.
They got into the healthy at any size movement.
And the whole big food narrative alongside it.
Yeah, the accusation was pretty stark.
Yeah.
That big food companies might have sort of co-opted dietitians.
To push intuitive eating and maybe dial down food shame.
While still selling, products that aren't exactly health food.
It paints a pretty cynical picture, if true. Like twisting a positive message for profit.
But then there's the counter-argument they raise, which is also important.
Right. Being sensitive, avoiding shame, absolutely crucial. But ignoring the actual health risks of obesity, that's harmful too.
They cited that number. 170 associated health issues, comorbidities. That's staggering.
It is. And while they touched on the psychological side, like weight gain sometimes being a subconscious way to desexualize oneself.
Which is a complex idea in itself.
For sure, but you can't ignore the physical reality either. It's about finding that line between shaming, which is bad, and educating or encouraging change positively.
From a place of self-care, not self-hate.
Exactly. And this ties right into the engineered food environment they talked about.
Oh, yeah. The huge jump in obesity since the 70s.
It's dramatic.
And how we're just surrounded by unhealthy choices constantly.
Even in places like bookstores. Or hospitals, ironically.
Often helped along by government contracts, subsidies. It's systemic.
The point being, it's not just about willpower when the whole environment seems designed to make you fail.
It's incredibly hard to resist that constant bombardment.
Yeah, it really is.
Then the conversation took another pretty concerning turn, early onset cancer.
That statistic was jarring. A 79% increase in diagnoses for people aged 18 to 49.
Over the last 2 decades. And crucially, they noted this data was from before the COVID vaccine rollout.
That's a key point. It forces you to ask, okay, what else is going on?
And they floated potential environmental factors, pesticides like Roundup containing glyphosate.
And mentioning glyphosate's history, its connection to chemical warfare research, it broadens the picture. Are environmental toxins playing a bigger role in all these rising health issues?
Makes you wonder. They also touched briefly, personally even, on wildfires.
Yeah, losing homes and the feeling that the response, the prevention, it wasn't adequate.
Like having an empty reservoir nearby or delays despite warnings just highlights failures in managing these disasters.
That personal experience brings a different weight to it, doesn't it? The human cost of these systemic failures.
Absolutely. Okay, now, brace yourself. A shift into politics and ideology, specifically wokeness.
Right. Jillian Michaels described her own sort of political evolution, feeling the left had changed.
Contrasting what she called real progressivism with current trends she finds concerning.
And she gave examples, like debates around gender identity affecting women's spaces or sports.
And critiques of things like virtue flags or this idea of an oppression hierarchy.
It reflects a viewpoint that feels certain modern progressive ideas have maybe gone too far or lost sight of older principles.
Building on that, they went into gender-affirming care for minors. A really hot-button issue.
Very much so. And they presented a critical perspective, framing it as potentially harmful and possibly driven by money.
They cited data suggesting worse mental health outcomes post-transition, though that data is definitely debated.
Highly debated, and context matters hugely there.
And they used really strong language, comparing puberty blockers to chemical castration drugs.
That terminology itself shows a deep skepticism, obviously.
They didn't hold back, drew parallels to lobotomies, and pointed fingers at financial incentives.
Mentioning the Human Rights Campaign rating system for hospitals based on this care.
And funding connections to pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer.
Suggesting that profit motives could potentially override ethical concerns.
Even using the term child sacrifice in that context, which is incredibly strong.
It's a very serious accusation, highlighting a profound mistrust of the system surrounding this specific medical care.
They also talked about social influence, right? How positive feedback and reinforcement might shape identity, especially in kids.
Suggesting a need for caution and looking at the whole picture, including social factors.
This whole discussion about influence then broadened out. Human vulnerability, groupthink.
Using the Manson family as a chilling example, how could someone like Manson get such control over seemingly ordinary people?
It's baffling. And they connected it, maybe controversially, to things like CIA mind control experiments.
MKUltra, Operation Midnight Climax, using LSD, raising questions about external manipulation.
And asking, did LSD just kind of unlock something already there, some vulnerability, or did it cause it?
It's an unsettling thought, and they link these ideas, brainwashing, cults, to wider things like political polarization today, information manipulation.
They brought up Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber.
Right, his involvement in those Harvard LSD studies that apparently involved humiliation.
And connecting his later anti-technology stance back to those experiences. It's a dark thread.
A potential tragic outcome of maybe well-intentioned but ethically questionable research. And it speaks to the dangers of unchecked technology now, too. Surveillance, algorithms shaping what we see and think, bots influencing discourse.
They even use Sharia law as an example of groupthink, how deeply ingrained beliefs can shape societies.
And went further with Manson, mentioning allegations that maybe authorities were even told to let him go despite violations.
Which, if true, is deeply disturbing. Adds another layer of potential conspiracy or at least massive failure.
These are heavy claims, contributing to a narrative of distrust around official stories.
They also briefly touched on using substances in conflict, like Nazis using methamphetamines.
Or unverified claims about Hamas fighters during the October 7th attacks. It's a recurring, ugly tactic throughout history, it seems.
Which leads to the capacity for human atrocity. With or without drugs. The danger of othering people.
Dehumanizing them. Making violence easier.
That phrase came up. Being nice until it's time to not be nice.
Exploring that protective instinct, the potential for violence to defend loved ones, even while personally hating violence. It's a paradox in human nature.
They used The Walking Dead as a cultural reflection of this capacity for darkness.
And asked, what's the antidote? Suggesting maybe it requires a strong ethical defense, not just wishful thinking.
Then the lesser of two evils argument came up, thinking about horrific acts like, say, the nuclear bombings in World War II.
Justifying something monstrous for what's seen as a greater good, it's a slippery slope, isn't it?
A dangerous one. Does defeating evil sometimes require becoming a kind of monster yourself? Heavy stuff.
Deeply unsettling ethical territory.
And it circles back to groupthink, how easily we can get swept up, how vital critical thinking is.
Especially when the story is compelling or fits our biases.
And how rare it is for people or institutions to just say, we were wrong.
That difficulty admitting error seems like a running theme through many of these topics, holding on to dogma.
Which naturally led them to the pharmaceutical industry again, the potential for profit over patients.
Using the example of what they called the war on peptides and stem cells.
Suggesting these could be cutting-edge treatments being maybe suppressed or slow-walked.
Because of financial interests. The argument is that the corporate obligation to shareholders can sometimes clash with what's best for health outcomes.
Leading to things like influencing studies, maybe compromising politicians.
And they specifically pointed to the revolving door issue, people moving between the FDA and the companies they're supposed to regulate.
That's a massive conflict of interest right there. They mentioned a book for you, the listener, about how good laws get twisted by powerful industries.
It highlights how these systemic problems can get baked in.
And briefly, they touched on the political angle excitement some feel about figures like Bobby Kennedy Jr. maybe joining forces with someone like Trump.
Driven by a perception that they both want to tackle these deep systemic issues you've just laid out. A desire for fundamental change, perhaps.
Okay, another shift. The autism debate. Causes the rising rates.
They really question the purely genetic explanation.
Given how sharply rates have climbed, especially, they noted, in boys in California.
Highlighting the resistance sometimes to even consider environmental factors or other contributors.
And they drew a parallel there to the defensiveness some parents might feel about gender transition questions.
Suggesting maybe deeply held beliefs on any side can make it hard to look at alternative explanations objectively.
Plus, they pointed out, it's not just autism rates going up.
Right. Look at early onset cancer, obesity, infertility, type 2 diabetes in kids, all rising concurrently.
Can genetics alone explain all of that happening relatively quickly? It makes you question if there are common underlying factors we're missing or ignoring.
It suggests we need to look broader, perhaps at environmental or lifestyle shifts across the board.
Then back to politics, critiquing tribalism, the use versus them mentality.
Using deportation cases as an example of selective outrage.
Contrasting the case of a Maryland father with alleged gang ties getting lots of attention.
Versus, say, a gay hairdresser facing deportation for immigration fraud, who maybe didn't fit the preferred narrative for outrage on the left, according to their discussion.
Questioning why the focus lands where it does. Highlighting inconsistencies driven by political framing.
And showing how complex things like asylum claims and deportation orders get simplified in these debates.
They also tackled the open borders issue directly. Very contentious.
Raising concerns about security, societal impacts.
Mentioning specific worries about undocumented immigrants being moved to swing states or getting Social Security numbers, divisive points.
Reflecting anxieties that are definitely part of that conversation.
And they made sure to state support for legal immigration.
While highlighting the strain they perceive from uncontrolled illegal immigration on infrastructure, resources, that distinction is key to their viewpoint.
Nearly at the end here, they briefly touched on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Incredibly complex.
Acknowledging the monstrous acts of Hamas.
But also expressing concern over actions that harm civilians or aid workers on the Palestinian side.
And the danger of that mindset where anyone helping the perceived enemy, even with aid, becomes the enemy too. So many layers, such tragedy.
It really is. Okay, wrapping up. They stress learning from history, like the dangers exemplified by figures like Hitler.
But cautioning against quickly accusing people of not having learned those lessons just because they engage in open, maybe uncomfortable discussion.
Jillian shared that personal bit about initially misjudging Bobby Kennedy Jr.
Yeah, before actually reading his book, a good reminder to maybe withhold judgment, stay open.
So what a journey, huh?
Yeah.
This deep dive really wove through so many connected, complex issues. It reflects the world you navigate, too.
Absolutely. And hopefully it reinforces how crucial it is to, think critically, to question the narratives.
And dig deeper than the surface level,
Yeah.
which is what we aim to help you do.
Were there some aha moments in there, maybe connecting dots between things like those old CIA experiments and modern information control?
Or the financial incentives possibly shaping medical narratives. It definitely makes you pause.
It does. And maybe, just maybe, the most useful tool through all this complexity is still good old common sense.
Seems simple, but maybe harder to find sometimes. Yeah. Okay, so here's a final thought for you to mull over.
Go on.
To what extent is our modern world in question, the digital spaces, the physical environment, the food we eat, engineered, maybe subtly, maybe not so subtly, to influence how we think and behave?
That's a big question.
It is. And following from that,
Mm-hmm.
what steps can you personally take to cultivate more awareness, more autonomy in the face of all that? Something to think about. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.